Miami Dolphins leadership in Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel spoke to the South Florida media to debrief the 2024 season yesterday. Have my reactions here today on this episode of Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, and the author of Touchdown Miami on Substack. I want to give a special shout out and thank you to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. You could start the playoffs with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $200 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet over at FanDuel.com. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Chris Grier, Mike McDaniel spoke to the media yesterday, almost 24 hours ago. I'm recording about 11 a.m. And I had a chance to watch it in real time as it unfolded. And then I watched it again this morning and made notes for central themes and things that I thought. And I know everybody did a psychoanalysis of everything that was said. And I think there was some candidness in here. And I believe that when they say there were a lot of hard lessons that were learned through the course of the 2024 season, I do generally believe they, through their comments, which we're going to get into a lot of the central themes, did kind of passively acknowledge some of the shortcomings that they themselves, as the brain trust of this team, has signed themselves up for. And whether or not there is a self-awareness and a course correction that comes with that is what's really going to be most notable for me. And we'll talk about that at the end of the show. The Dolphins did, however, they released a statement yesterday that they had signed 12 players to futures contracts. And I wanted to make sure I touched on this because this is important from a bookkeeping perspective. Wide receiver Tariq Black, linebacker William Bradley King, safety Jordan Colbert, to defensive tackle Neil Farrell, offensive tackle Ryan Hayes, offensive lineman Chasen Hines, Daquan Jackson, a linebacker, cornerback Isaiah Johnson, cornerback Jason Maitre, offensive tackle Baron Matos, linebacker Derek McClendon, and tight end Hayden Rusi. All those players, or the majority of those players that showcased in some capacity for the Dolphins in the preseason, namely practice squad candidates and developmental type players. I'm very fired up to see a few names on this list. Hayden Rusi, Isaiah Johnson, Jason Maitre, Jordan Colbert at safety, I think are the ones that really move the needle. But that's an important footnote in the midst of this press conference because it really does mark kind of the first step. I believe this puts the Dolphins at 49 players under contract for their offseason roster. You need 51 to count against the salary cap. So anything that comes after the 51st highest ranked player does not count against the salary cap. This puts you within 2 players of that, I believe. And then there's some restricted free agents the Dolphins will make decisions on if they want to tender them, and they should be up over 51 in no time. But enough of the bookkeeping and offseason roster stuff. The central theme, accountability. Mike McDaniel, Chris Grier asked about it in the shape of Tyreek Hill, in the shape of players being late to meetings and the disciplinary actions not resonating with this group the way that they had in every other place Mike McDaniel has been, according to Mike McDaniel in the press conference yesterday. And I can't decide which I think would be a worse hypotheticals or worse hypothetical. You know, Mike McDaniel said he's going to adjust his process and make sure the team-wide knowledge is anytime that things are done that aren't in the best interest of winning football games. A bunch of different reasons. There were guys that had certain fines that didn't have any. There were some people that had multiple that I think there's different ways to counteract that. Bringing it up as a team and continuing to find guys wasn't enough. So I'm not going to continue to just place all the blame on some of the smallest individuals that were multiple offenders. Tells you there were degrees of contributors to the team that were multiple offenders when he phrases it like that. And it's little stuff like that when Jonnu Smith talks about for where we want to go, we more structure, right? More disciplinary feedback. Is it worse if Mike McDaniel just kind of set the disciplinary factors at the beginning of the year and it played itself out and we didn't adjust? Or is it worse that we were cognitively aware that there were players of all different varying degrees of contributors to this roster, and all of them who were multiple offenders continued to be fined and penalized in the same fashion, and presumably there was no change, and now we feel we need to make a change at the end of the season? I can't decide which one's worse. If it was just plug and play, this is what it's going to be for the year, or if you were more hands-on with it and just chose to continue to try to punish guys the same way. I will say this, though. There's room for all different kinds of player cultures and locker room cultures and leadership cultures. But too much of anything is a bad thing. And I think that was one of the things I was asked after yesterday's show. As far as Mike being very pro-player oriented, and there's a comfort there and that there had been success there. And you could tell that comfort bred complacency with some of the players and their obligations to this football team. I don't know who those players are. You can kind of have a general inkling of who maybe some of them were. But those are the kinds of players that if you're going to make structural changes to your disciplinary action, just bear in mind the players that have been here throughout this process of you being the coach of the team, Mike McDaniel. I don't think that's the kind of thing you could just put the toothpaste back in the tube. Now, what I did appreciate is that he was asked about this as far as following up. Does this team need a culture change? And what would be a punitive action if someone continues to be late or takes themselves out of a game? And Mike said, I think it's pretty important that you let guys know that there are a point in our team where guys are fully aware of expectations. And if your actions continually lead to finable offenses, that you're telling me without words that you don't want to be here. I think that's very clear. I think it's not an indictment necessarily of all, but we're subject to everyone's actions as a football team. So we'll address those as such. Yes. And I think that goes right up to the top with number 10, where he was asked about the relationship with number 10. And Mike said, I was very direct with him. He was honest with me. It was great terms that we were discussed multiple things without wavering that it's not acceptable to leave a game and won't be tolerated in the future. And he embraced accountability. So if you're going to get serious about that kind of stuff, a message like that, I think would be a message that the overall culture of the locker room would perk up and pay attention to, that things are going to be different around here. And not just because 10 asked to leave in the immediate aftermath of a post game after you told him before you told him his actions that he chose to do in that game were unacceptable. Injuries, unsurprisingly, were another central theme of the conversation. And that kind of put into a few players being in the spotlight as far as the focus on Tua Tagovailoa, for example. And there was some pretty pointed feedback for Tua Tagovailoa. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel, specifically Chris Grier, talked about Tua and his his durability and not being available for taking chances and risk is unacceptable to us. And he knows that. That's a direct quote from Chris Grier. We'll talk about Tua. We're talking a little bit about the offensive line. They got asked about investing in the offensive line after the infamous quote that I so love to continue to see just spammed on social media and on the comments on our shows. And you guys don't got to tell me. I know it. And it seems like they know it now too. So we're going to get into some player specific type stuff coming up next year on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets. Win or lose, the FanDuel app gives you everything you need to place live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Right now, over on FanDuel, you could find some of the playoff games that at least I think are compelling. Houston plus 2.5 at home is an interesting line to me. Philadelphia minus 4.5 is a tempting line to me. And I think the Rams at home plus 1.5 is an interesting line to me as well. So never waste a hunch. Make every moment more over at FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So between Tua Tagovailoa and the offensive line and what they were asked about, Tyreek Hill and his request for trade, and Chris Grier said he didn't backtrack, but he didn't ask me for a trade. Whatever that means. But very much on more than one occasion, the availability of Tua Tagovailoa, which we know is continuously a thing. It's been a thing in all but one season that he's been here, a member of the Dolphins. The commonality between a lot of the issues that Tua has had has been putting himself outside of the structure of a play in a position to take contact. That is after interceptions, like the one against the Rams. That is trying to run over DeMar Hamlin. That is trying to scramble for a first down early in the game against Houston. That is all three of the concussion incident type plays that was suffered against Buffalo in week 2 in 2022. That was an outside the pocket type of play. The play against Cincinnati was a very easily avoidable hit by a nose tackle that chased you down on a deep set drop back where you didn't rip the ball down the field and then got tackled because you couldn't shake a guy. And then the Green Bay play was an outside of structure play as well. So you look at the last 2 years of the incidences that have contributed to the durability stuff that has really kept him off the field. And all of those incidences, all of them since Mike McDaniel has been here, have been the kinds of hits that you can selectively avoid taking by surrendering downs. And I know that is not an ideal way to play when you want everybody to hang it all out on every single play. But this is the player that they've made the commitment to, and they are very directly telling him at this stage that what the expectations are. It was asked about the evaluation. Chris Grier was asked about the evaluation of Tua. It was good to see his growth as a player when he was playing. The fact that we threw in when he was playing. I would say one of the things that came out this year was the leadership part. All the players talking about his leadership and the step that he's taken. That being said, he needs to be available. This is a direct quote from Chris Grier. That said, he needs to be available. He needs to know how to protect himself. You're going to get hit at times. It's always going to happen, but he needs to control what he can control. He understands that. I don't know if he does. He understands that, Chris said. Not being available for taking chances and risk is unacceptable to us, and he knows that. And they further alluded to and talked to his competitive drive and how hard it was for him to miss games. And he already took accountability for letting the guys down in the first chapter of the season with the way things went in week 2. Good. I hope that lingers and stays with Tua as a player. And you can get into whether it's fair or not fair to expect a player to minimize his own hits when their style of play already mitigates the risk that he has, and how that's a high risk investment that they've made. And everybody knows that, right? But if this is the course that you've charted yourself on, some of the responsibility here for the player has to fall in the hands of the player. You could get into the responsibility of those who offered the contract and signed the contract. At this point is water on the bridge. Sitting here and whatting into the wind about things that can't be undone. And there's pathways and flexibility for just about every contract extension to make a dramatic course correct. But it's simply not as simple as just, oh, well, let's make a change. Because it's very clear now that this group is coaching and managing for their longevity in positions as members of this organization. So I don't think you could just sit here and say, well, they have the out in the Tua contract. They're going to pivot and change directions. And if you told me that they explored all options and saw what else was out there in that market, they'd probably be remiss if they didn't do their due diligence. But the likelihood of finding stuff feels pretty slim. And the timeline in which you'd have to make a decision on anything to dramatically change your situation in that regard, you got a little less than a little more than 2 months, because his 2026 salary guarantees on March 14th. So the messaging is very strong here. And I applaud that messaging because I understand he is always going to be a high-risk player relative to the standard NFL player for being durable as a quarterback. The things that I think he needs to do, and I said this last January, I just pulled a receipt for somebody on social media. It was January 4th last year, which was 17 games of immobile Tua. It would be far more valuable than 12 games of a smaller, more agile Tua. And I'll be darned if that's not exactly how it played out this year, except he played 11 games instead of 12. I thought it was interesting when asked about the offensive line. And they made that comment in 2023. And I think if they hadn't had backups play out of 4 or 5 spots, they probably would have been right in that group. And case in point, like they did have a very productive rushing attack with that group. But they happened to run into all the teams when they were outgunned and outmanned with players who, some of them had no injury history whatsoever in the NFL. So some of it is bad luck. But when you thumb your nose at it with the way in which they did, it's going to linger, right? And then sure enough, they chose to double down on experience in the system. Although Chris Grier did say Isaiah Wynn was a setback. We expected him back much quicker than what it happened, so he didn't come back until late in the season. Chris Grier described Austin Jackson as a huge loss. I think we can all appreciate the value Austin Jackson does bring to the field at this point. No, he's not going to be the best pass protecting player down 21 points against Von Miller. And I know that's everybody's favorite thing to point to criticize Austin Jackson. It's a quality starter at tackle. Specifically in this scheme, he's a quality starter because he was a huge asset in the run game. And they described it as such too. Through week 9 or 10, we were still up there running the ball, moving, playing well. It was a huge loss for us. When he went down, it was like a slow bleed for the rest of the year with the guys playing through stuff, being nicked. And that's where you get into some of the players that have been staple figures at tackle and on the offensive line the last couple of years. And they're guys that have durability background issues. And those are the kinds of guys that you shop for. So they allude to injuries being a contributing factor. And that is true. And it is extenuating circumstances in some way, shape, and form. But those were the players that you shopped for. Those were the players that you committed to. And when you make the commitment, then like the accountability of it just doesn't become, well, we had bad luck. You did have bad luck, but you didn't help your luck. And Teron Armstead played more snaps this year than I think he played in any year since 2020 or something like that, 2019. But Kendall Lamb, he somehow managed to play almost half of his career snaps as an NFL player on offense. The last 2 years in Miami, he played a decade in the league. And a lot of it was because of durability stuff. So when you get to the end of the year and when poor Jackson Carman caught a body in here, Chris Grier says, I mean, we had games where Jackson Carman was playing tackle. And I didn't make any kind of secret about how poorly I thought that experience went. But when the general manager goes up here in the postseason debriefing press conference and says, guys, I know it was bad. We had Jackson Carman playing right tackle. Yeah, it was. And he was getting all the practice reps because Teron doesn't practice during the week. And Kendall Lamb was put on IR. So leading up to the Jets game, the tackles practicing at practice was Jackson Carman at right tackle and Patrick Paul at left. And then you get to the game, and Pat's playing right, and Teron guts the whole thing out and plays on one leg at left tackle. So things like that, you kind of signed yourself up for some of, regardless of how you chuckled at the time. And you did have a good group with 8 guys deep, but then you got pushed to your 9th guy. And this year, I think you probably had 6 good guys, and you got pushed to your 8th and 9th guys again with depth. So at some point, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again. And if they do have dramatic change in that room, and they will at guard because neither Rob Jones or Liam Eichenberg are under contract as things currently stand, and then Kendall Lamb is expected to retire, and Teron Armstead obviously needs to make a decision on if he's even going to play next year, let alone if he's going to play for the Dolphins. They said, yes, we're going to have to invest in the offensive line now. That's Chris Grier. And he kind of alluded to going back to what things were like before Mike McDaniel got here. This is the time, again, like we did a few years ago with Austin and Rob Hunt and Solomon Kinley and such. This is the time for us to start investing in some offensive linemen. Well, that's a top 20 pick. That's a top 40 pick. That was the player you gave up 2 day 3 picks for. And that's where that's the biggest thing for me with anytime you get into the conversation about the assignment of blame for the offensive line being in the situation that it's in. All player personnel decisions, the blame ultimately goes at the feet of the general manager because he's the player or the person who allocates the talent. But it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that when Chris Grier was put in unilateral control of football operations and you had Brian Flores in here, I don't think it's a coincidence that they drafted a tackle and a college tackle who played guard and then another guard in the first round, the second round in the top 40, and traded 2 fours to go up and get another guy all in the same class. So if you're cyclically, if you've exhausted your commitment to this group, which it sounds like they have, and that should be a thing that we do applaud, regardless of the fact that we all felt it was coming earlier, and we knew it was going to be limiting in how you tried to create a menu to problem solve throughout any game that you're going to play throughout the course of the season. At least we're here, right? And there's 2 players out of the 3 that were named there. And I know we're down on football operations and we're down on Chris, and we want more new sets of eyes to be involved in this process. And it is a critical window for the Dolphins right now to get this right. But at least you can invoke names like Austin and Rob Hunt and say, those are good players. Austin, it took a while. Austin was he was overdrafted based on his potential, and it took several scheme changes and a lot of time to get there. And the Dolphins don't have that luxury this time around. So it doesn't necessarily make you feel any better. And that's why it matters most what they do and not what they say. And that's where my final thoughts lie with this press conference. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Stick with us. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football. It's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best place to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or touchdowns for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, whether you're looking for a flex player or boost your payout, or you want cash quickly. Prize Picks has got you covered with over 10 million members and billions with a B in winnings. It's clear that people are loving Prize Picks. Here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today. Use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Prize Picks. Run your game. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play that first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Has Rocket Money helped you find any subscriptions that you forgot about or didn't realize you were maybe paying for more than once? Happens to all of us. And Rocket Money has made it easy to track those subscriptions down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together into one place on the app, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or the goals for savings in the upcoming year. Rocket Money has saved 5 million users, total of more than 500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions. Reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked on today. That's rocketmoney.com/locked on. Rocketmoney.com/locked on. I don't think there's anything that they could have said that make me feel better. And they went on to talk about a bunch of other things too. I mean, they talked about how they did take backup quarterback seriously, but because of the compensatory pick formulas, they couldn't spend in a certain budget. So they had to kind of sit on their hands, and they could only offer so much. And then they finished runner up to a number of veteran quarterbacks as a result of that, but players that wanted to be here and were receptive to being here. And that's great. But at the end of the day, you did invest in backup quarterback and it bit your season in the rear end, right? So I understand some of the context that they provide. But this cannot be just pass the buck down as far as where this season went wrong. And that's why the most important that this team can do this offseason is to make sure that everybody's in place for OTAs, mini camps, training camp. Get your contracts figured out. If guys don't want to be here, get them off the roster. Target the right kinds of players. And that is a twofold proposition. That is, from a football character standpoint, I think this team went after a lot of big personalities in stretches. And then they had a lot of success. And they had a lot of success with a coach that was very hands-off. And then when the success waned, the response to that was not particularly healthy. And it kind of stripped away some goodwill that was built here in the first 2 years of this iteration of the regime. So you need to assess who those common themes were that threatened that and continue to threaten that in the future moving forward, and mend whatever long-term players that are going to be here relationships are strained because of any of that, and players that are towards the end of their contributing levels at the degree in which they're invested in here. Now's a great chance to reset the deck and be cognizant of the kind of people you bring in behind them. But then the other side of that coin is stylistically and brand of football players. Mike was asked about the toughness of this football team, and he talked about, depending on the application of it, there's areas where it needs to be better, and there's a lot of room for growth and an opportunity for growth, and he invoked offensive short yardage situations in that. The challenge with that is it's been like that for 3 years. They've never been able to just get up and run the ball on third down. Not with consistency. But then he alluded to defensively, the vice tackling and rallies for getting depth to take away deep throws and then rallying and stepping up and limiting yards after catch on checkdowns. That was a strong area for the team with physicality. And I'd agreed in some ways. I didn't forget the Green Bay game. I remember that game happened, and there certainly wasn't a lot of good vice tackling in that game. But that's the kind of show me that I need to see from this group. You want to tell us you're going to invest in backup quarterback, and they invoke the draft when talking about a backup quarterback or the QB2 position? Great. Go ahead and draft a guy. I don't know when it's going to make sense based on the available talent in this year's class. Does one slide to you on day 2, or is one slide to you? One of the top 2 guys slide to you in the first round? Do you get a guy in the 5th round? Like those are all kinds of things that they have to vet. But show me. Don't make an earnest effort and say, well, it didn't quite work out, so it didn't happen for us. So Snoop Huntley is going to be the 2 next year. because I can appreciate, again, I feel like more so than some, the context of why things didn't work out well for them, but it doesn't absolve you from the responsibility of the fact that it happened. So now you have to take actionable efforts to amend those issues and illustrate that it's not just lip service of, well, we had some bad breaks and we had some guys that got hurt and we tried, but we didn't acquire anybody. But we did try, and we knew that we needed to be better here. Okay. So be better here. Be better with accountability. Be better with the culture within the locker room. If you're going to be a player-led oriented locker room, you got to ask yourself, what is an easier way to reaching that optimal goal? Is it by continuing to have whatever players are in the locker room that make your life harder in that regard, where you need to invest more time and more resources and more guidelines and be more oppressive to every player in the locker room, and strip away more player flexibility and player rights off the clock to get that achieved for a handful of people? Or is it easier to look at some of those players, the root causes of them, and say, oh, perhaps it's easier to have 80% of your talent level with somebody else and still have all those time and resources to invest in the players that we don't need to dramatically change how we approach leadership and culture in this building to accommodate. Be better about investing in the offensive line. Be better about getting serious with the backup quarterback. And I don't think they're going to be hunting for compensatory picks this year like they did last year. They don't have that much big contracts off the books. And Javon Holland's the big contract. And the response with Javon was not overly warm and fuzzy. Javon's been a good player here. This is Chris Grier. Watched him grow both on and off the field as a person. You guys have gotten to see his personality. We put those talks on hold once the season started. Both sides agreed, let's just let him focus on the year. We're going to go through everything like we always do and talk through his year and see what happens here in the offseason. I mean, that's not very warm and fuzzy. So, and I don't know that I would put a contract offer in front of Javon that would probably reach what his appetite is either. But you be better about proactively if you have guys that are here and they're extension eligible. And they did that with some guys. They did that with Zach Sealer. And I'll give Chris Grier credit for this. He went to bat for Zach Sealer and Devon Achane for the Pro Bowl. And the transcript has it as that's expletive. And I know what he said, and I agree with him, specifically with Zach Sealer. Double-digit sacks, 2 straight years, not being a Pro Bowl talent. Him and Zach Allen both in Denver got hosed, man. No concern on the hip long-term for Tua Tagovailoa. Needs to get better. When Chris Grier was asked about the build and postseason success, and they alluded to not having 6.5 games your starting quarterback, and we miss it by a game. To me, that's the difference. Yes, but also no. Because yes, you mathematically probably be in, and you missed it by 2 games, or you were 8-9. The Broncos were 10-7. I don't think you can just delude yourself with an alternate reality in which Tua doesn't miss 6.5 games and say, well, we'd have been a playoff team. The fundamental issues around this team from this year specifically that existed last year, I think, for different reasons. More so with injuries, but that's, again, because you sign yourself up for that kind of pathway with the players that you allocate in some of those spots. That still exists. So what the Dolphins choose to do and not say, it's going to speak very loudly for me about where I feel this team is at going into 2025. The good news is we don't have to wait that long. And we're going to start the process here in the coming days and weeks of doing performance reviews and seeing individual players who was a part of the problem, who was part of the solution, what that looks like. I look forward to doing all that, and I hope you will come back and join me for all of that. I'm Kyle Krabs. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Go Fins. I'm out of here.